time to free you from the four walls of today for a half hour of high adventure.
This week, we're here with Dr. Emily Thomas. Emily is a lecturer here at Durham University. I was actually lucky enough this year to be a student in her modern philosophy class. Emily studied at Cambridge for her PhD, where she co-founded the Cambridge Women in Philosophy group, and is also an editor for the British Journal of the History of Philosophy. Amongst everything else, Emily is also the author of a philosophy blog online, emilythomaswrites.co.uk, which has a very cool section called Philosophical Street Photos, which you should definitely check out if you have the time. We're also here with Stuart Flegg. Stuart was the JCR president of John Snow College here at Durham. After studying psychology, Stuart completed a master's in management, and amongst countless other awards listed on his LinkedIn page, he was the recipient of the Durham Award in 2014 and was also my housemate last year. Welcome both to
Thank you very much.
That reminds me, I still have one of your jumpers.
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay, right. We'll have to sort that out afterwards.
Alongside your impressive resume.
Yeah.
So we're talking about women in philosophy today and feminist philosophy. So Aristotle, arguably one of the greatest philosophers of all time, described women as deformed males. Presumably things have moved on quite a bit since then.
They have moved on, but not as quickly as one would hope. So there's a great passage in Nicholas Malebranche. He's a 17th century writer where he describes women's mushy brain fibres. Nice. C.D. Broad, who was an early 20th century philosopher, writes in a book review of a woman philosopher that she should go back to sweeping the kitchen. So things have progressed, but not quite as fast as one would have hoped.
Does it present any sort of problems for a woman teaching Aristotle or one of these philosophers? People have their heroes in philosophy. I wouldn't imagine as a woman you would have Aristotle as your hero saying that sort of comment.
That's a good question. I think that when teaching history of philosophy, we generally are happy to think of people as people of their time. It's okay, we make allowances for the fact he was writing 2,000 years ago or that Malebranche was writing 300 years ago. Of course, what would not be okay is if people are saying that stuff now.
But is there more of a problem in philosophy? People are supposed to have these universal systems of values.
Yes.
It's not like a historian or
Yeah.
I don't know, a mathematician who makes these comments. Like, philosophy is supposed to be the subject where you make it right and you're able to step outside of the paradigm, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's true. The problem with someone like Aristotle is that his philosophy has just come down to us over 2,000 years. We're still using Aristotelian ways of thinking about all kinds of things. And then if there's this deep misogyny or sexism embedded at the root of his philosophy, and there definitely is, that's a worry then. How much of that is still around now? It's a good question. But what you said about paradigms, that philosophy is supposed to be something that steps out of paradigms, I personally am very doubtful about that.
Oh, really?
But yes, I very much think philosophy is a creature of paradigms just as much as something like science.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are paradigm shifts, but you're still very much tied to the one that you're in at the time.
Yeah. I think that things come down to us from past paradigms. But I still think that philosophy has paradigm shifts.
Okay.
Is there sort of an assumption there that some of the things Aristotle said must be like fundamentally correct if you've built an entire subject around them? Or, as you said you believe that some of the things he said are essentially a little bit sexist.
Yeah.
Does that affect some of the conclusions he's drawn? Does that perhaps affect like the way philosophy is today?
To answer that question fully,
it's two questions, really, but...
it's great. To answer it fully, I would need to be an Aristotle scholar. What I can tell you is what some feminist scholars of Aristotle say, which is this kind of sexism, thinking of women as deformed males, and then equating various parts of his metaphysics in a so that wasn't very clear. So he thinks of some parts of metaphysics as gendered. So some things in the world he thinks are male, and other things he thinks are female, in this kind of deep philosophical way. And then if we're still using bits of his metaphysics, and the metaphysics was gendered to start with, then the worry is that some of that is coming down to us now.
So Genevieve Lloyd said that from Aristotle to Hume, Plato to Sartre, reason has always been associated with maleness, and that sort of leads us to critique the notion of reason as a whole. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's true. It's certainly true that reason has been associated with maleness for centuries and centuries. And so that has been a problem right up until the 20th century, really, with people thinking about men as beings of pure reason who can sit up on their mountainous heights and do logic and mathematics and think carefully and clearly about important issues. And then women are bodily creatures confused by our hormones and our mushy brain fibres, who are just not suited to these high flights of reason. You even find people like Darwin saying this.
So do you think that means we need to restructure the whole idea of reason as a whole, or can we still sort of stand by it?
I think it means we need to re-examine it, actually. You have some philosophers who would say that the concept of reason as we use it today has nothing to do with its history, that we should just take the concept as it is, and in that case there doesn't seem to be anything gendered about it, and then that's fine. There are other philosophers with a more historical empathy, like me, who think that the history of a concept really matters. And then, yes, I think that we should be reevaluating things like the concept of reason.
Do you think there's a problem with feminist philosophers using the history of philosophy as a sort of resource for their own work? If they're trying to write their own theory and then they're using these concepts which are gendered and have these sorts of misogynistic undertones?
That's nice, yeah. I mean, yeah, presumably feminist philosophers would say that they're trying to examine these concepts precisely to distance them from the problems. But you might well make a case that they're using some of the same concepts in order to examine them.
Sounds like a bit of a minefield.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's fair. Yeah, it's also a relatively recent minefield. People have only been working on like the history of feminism for the last 20, 30 years in any great numbers. Prior to that, it was a really, really tiny area.
You were saying earlier about reason being something that's historically male, and like to me that association hasn't been there. So I think that might be the association you have from looking into philosophy. But then again, I can see perhaps where you're coming from with things like, if I think about like the statue of the thinker, it's a man, and then I think about things like hysteria, that's like that literally translates as woman's problem, or so I can see this historical thing. But do you think that, because you did say some people distance themselves from it, do you think sort of just in like vernacular use, reason has that gender still? Do you think it's something we have in society, or is it specifically in philosophy?
I think it's something we have in society.
Okay.
I'll give you a few examples.
Yeah.
So one is that boys are perceived to be better at maths than girls. Even though statistically that's often not the case. There is this stereotype that, boys are good at science and maths and girls are good at languages and history and English and all these kind of softer subjects. And it's no accident that they're perceived to be softer. And we had this scandal recently, I think it was one of the Google employees. He said there aren't many women in high-ranking positions in computer sciences because they're just not that good at computer science. I'm paraphrasing. So I very much think these sorts of things are around. And there's still huge underrepresentation of women in science and in mathematics and computer science. Philosophy, there's also huge underrepresentation. And in that regard, it's a bit of an outlier. That most humanities now are generally fairly well balanced, not necessarily at the very top, but they certainly are in the middle. And philosophy is a huge outlier.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's a few different reasons why. So there was a report carried out on this 5-6 years ago now that I played a small part in, and various reasons were suggested. So one is the problem of stereotype threat. So if a discipline is stereotyped in a certain way, so philosophy is stereotyped as male.
Bearded old men smoking a pipe.
Precisely,
Yeah.
sitting on a cloud, possibly.
Yeah.
Then if people perceive themselves to be not fitting that stereotype, they will actually underperform. And there's been various quite interesting experiments performed around this. So with school children, for example, if you give a group of girls a picture of a doll to colour in, and you give boys a picture of a truck to colour in, the girls will perform less well than a control group that was given nothing to colour in, because they've been reminded that they're female and women are worse at maths. But you can work it the other way as well. So if you remind people, say, that you're at Harvard, so you're really good, then you will outperform a control group who weren't reminded of their group status. So stuff like stereotype threat, I think, is definitely playing a role. And then there's all sorts of problems around implicit bias, where men and women are implicitly, unconsciously prejudiced against certain groups.
I did want to ask a question. Steve said it might be too personal, so feel free not to answer.
Okay.
But when you write papers, do you author them with your full name or do you use an initial? And do you think it matters?
I use my full name, and I do think it matters. Yeah.
Okay. The reason I ask is I know, I won't say they are, but I know a lot of the PhD students in sort of chemistry or physics.
Yeah.
The female students, they don't, like, it's more common, I think, to use initials anyway in those fields, but they really enjoy doing that because
of the anonymity.
Yeah.
I understand. It's certainly something that I thought about. When I was first starting to write papers, this was something I really debated. And some very early articles I sent in, I did use initials, not my name. And I think, in fact, it wasn't until I had a paper first accepted that then I said, oh, actually, I'm going to publish using my full name rather than initials. But I find it... So in theory, all papers are anonymously reviewed when you send them to journals and so on. I actually find it reassuring. Journal reports almost always refer to the author as he, and then I think, oh yes, my anonymity has been successfully protected.
Do you not worry then that maybe it'll affect people reading them if there are these implicit biases?
Yeah, I think...
Even if you get it into the journal anonymously, it's still out there on JSTOR or...
Yes, that's true. That people will read the work and think it's less good because it was authored by a woman. I do think that's a risk, but it's one I'm willing to take for the sake of, breaking down barriers. And women have been in philosophy for for a good 100 years now. So I'm not exactly at the forefront.
Could you say anything about what the philosophical canon is?
Yeah, okay. So the very idea of a canon goes right back to the Bible, and it's simply texts that are selected as being core to a certain message. So in philosophy, we think of canonical thinkers or texts as one that are central to the project of what philosophy is in some deep way. And a problem that feminist historians of philosophy face is that all canonical texts are male. So in the 17th century, for example, we have the grand canon of Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, David Hume, Kant,
Does that present a problem to you when you're deciding on the syllabus for your lectures? Because I was reading about, I think it's Shapiro, who advocates like the best supporting actress approach, where instead of replacing these canonical figures with women who perhaps weren't as significant in doing the theory, they'll have people who are sort of involved in the process who might have like an opposing view or something, and then you can kind of get them in that way. Yeah,
absolutely. So there are different historians think differently about this. Some historians want to get rid of the notion of a canon altogether. They think that having a canon somehow distorts the history, so that those canonical figures I just named, like let's say Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, they're all working within 60, 70 years of each other. But to just look at those figures like radically misses everything else that was going on in the period. So the canon is somehow distorting our understanding of the history. If you take that approach, then you're probably much less worried about the supporting actress kind of thing, because you're just interested in representing what was really going on. On the other hand, if you think, no, canonical texts are canonical for a reason, they were particularly influential, they've really shaped what's come down to us, then you need to find a place for women in the canon if you want to incorporate them.
Is it always the case that women aren't actually part of the canon itself, or has history sort of just obscured the fact a lot of the time because they didn't want to include them?
That's a great question.
Very difficult one to
it's not so hard.
Okay.
Up until the 18th century, women were included in histories of the period, often featuring quite prominently. And then from the 18th century onwards, they're just erased. All the names drop out of history entirely. I think it's fair to say that in the 17th century, none of the women were canonical, but some of them were incredibly well known, and played big parts in the period.
Princess Elizabeth, Bohemia.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, Margaret Cavendish, Anne Conway.
Do you think there could be potentially more canonical figures who have been missed out just because they're women?
That's a good question. Then I think it's going to depend on what you're looking for when you shape the canon.
Okay.
So you asked me how I picked figures to teach in my early modern course.
Yeah.
I wanted to teach women for all kinds of reasons. One is that I think their work is really interesting, and another is that they tie in quite nicely to the course because they're responding to the same problems. But a third is I always wanted the students to have the opportunity to pick from lesser well-known as well as well-known philosophical systems, and to have a chance for you to evaluate, well, do you think they're
broader understanding?
Yeah. Are they lesser known for a reason or not?
You've talked quite a lot about the history of philosophy, and I know that's one of the things you look at in your work, but I was wondering if you could explain how knowing who said something and how something was discovered affects sort of the fundamental truth, in as much as that's a stupid thing to say. But if that's all you're interested in, does it matter who said what?
Yeah, okay, good. So you might think it just matters what was said and not who said what. I think that's fair. I think some philosophers today would go further and say it doesn't matter what was said either. I think some philosophers today would take a very ahistorical approach and say, look, we have this philosophical question, who cares about the history? Let's just get into finding the right answer to the question. I'm not someone who thinks that, because I think the very questions that we have today are a contingent historical accident of what happened in the past. And then I think it's really important to find out what was said. And as a historian, I also want to know who said it.
Yeah, no, that's actually fair enough. That's a really good answer.
Oh, thank you. Lots of people would disagree. Right, but yeah, I'm not of the ahistorical camp.
Is that more of a thing in philosophy then than perhaps we mentioned some of these sort of harder sciences, like if you take physics, for example, does it really matter that Newton discovered gravity, or is knowing what gravity is? I imagine that's far more important in physics than Newton was sitting under a tree and he saw a fallen apple, or it hit him on the head, depending on how romanticised you want to be about it.
Absolutely. Let me say this. You might think that in order to really understand the theory of gravity, Newton's theory of gravity, you need to understand the context it arose in. And to understand that, you're going to have to know a little bit about who said it and why and what their motivations were. So that would be a case for contextualism.
Okay.
And you can take that to different degrees. So some people might think we don't need any context. We just need to know what the theories were, and that's it. Other people who are perhaps verging on history of ideas rather than history of philosophy would say, no, we need to know an awful lot about the context in order to really understand the theory itself. And I'm somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
So Locke had his famous tabula rasa, the blank slate where everyone is born equal and your character and intellect was formed by your experiences. Was that the first time that idea was made mainstream in the 17th century?
Yeah, it was. That's a good question. The debate about whether or not humans are born knowing anything had been going on for a really long time. But you're right, in the 17th century, John Locke was the person who really hammered it home. And his argument for the view that we are born knowing nothing was enormously influential.
And was that linked specifically to male and females, or was, because you could still say that all men were born equal and sort of have a clause for women?
Excellent question. Well, okay, so the fact that humans aren't born knowing anything, I don't think has any effect on whether you think there are male-female divides. But some of his supporters took it to mean that there's a case to be made if women were educated in the same way that men were, then they could be intellectual equals.
Was that also the same time that feminist philosophers bloomed? Was that when it all started happening?
In the 17th century, you have lots of proto-feminists, I think would be the word.
Okay.
So there are certainly women who are suggesting if only we were educated equally, we would be the intellectual equals of men. But feminism, as we know it today, is more of a full-blown, powerful theory. Didn't really emerge, I think, until the 18th century. And then you have people like Mary Wollstonecraft, vindication of the rights of women. And she was arguing for these things in detail in a really powerful way that I don't think her predecessors were.
Was she open to discuss these ideas? Was there any sort of prejudice to stop her actually publishing her papers?
Yeah, lots. Wollstonecraft was quite...
She tried to commit suicide, didn't she, at one point? And then miraculously saved, and then went on to publish all of her work. She published bits before the attempt and bits after. And she wrote a great volume of travel tales, if you ever want to read that, letters from Norway and Sweden, and where she effectively goes around chasing some pirates. It's a bit of a complicated story, but it's great. Sounds
I recommend it.
So was she the pioneer of women in philosophy? Was there... So you say she was a proto-feminist? I think Wollstonecraft was a feminist, full-blown. Okay. But the ones leading up to her, many women wrote on feminism before her, but I think it would be fair to say they didn't develop it into a full-blown theory in the way that she did. So it's important, there's a distinction between sort of women in philosophy and feminist philosophers. Yes, absolutely. Was there originally a lot of crossover between the two? And then it sort of separated? That's a great question. And the honest answer is I'm not sure. Okay. There are lots of women philosophers in history who are just as much women of their time as the men are of their time. So Margaret Cavendish at one point, I think, laments the fact that God gave men a greater capacity to reason. But on the other hand, she's arguing very strongly for increasing the level of women's education. So there's kind of mixed messages. And I think there are mixed messages in a few women, and then some simply don't comment on it. I read that you can write in a feminine voice in philosophy. There's a male and female voice. Yeah. What does that mean? Okay. It's not one that I've come across in literature, but I can tell you that as a student, I was frequently told to write like a man. Oh, really? Yeah, absolutely. What is writing like a man? Direct, clear, precise. At university? Yeah, at Cambridge. That's awful.
It's generally more jagged handwriting.
Absolutely, I think. Less sweeping curves, you know. Yeah. There's a worry, I think, that women, when they write, it can be apologetic or hesitant. So they say things like, I suggest, or perhaps it is the case. More tentative. Yeah, precisely. And it's not good that is associated with women. That should just be associated as a hesitant style of writing. But nonetheless, it is associated with women. Do you know any
professors or tutorial leaders who do that sort of thing today? Is that sort of mentality been wiped out, do you think?
No. I'm pretty sure it hasn't been. It's certainly not something that if I overheard one of my tutors saying to a student, write like a man, I would not be happy about that.
No, not at all.
It's not a very useful note, really, is it? If you don't know
what it means.
If you don't know what it is, yeah. But so you've suggested it's writing hesitantly. Is that not as good as writing sort of boldly?
Good question. I think in philosophy, your work would be taken less seriously if you're a very hesitant writer, rightly or wrongly. I think you'd perceive to be not really sure of what you're saying.
Well, one thing I have noticed, and maybe I just noticed it because we were talking about it. I was talking about it earlier with Steve. You've got a poster behind you. Is this people from Cambridge?
It is. Yeah.
And you've got Franklin, Crick, and Watson at the bottom left there. And the joke is, what did Watson and Crick discover in 1953? Rosalind Franklin's notes. So, but she's also the only woman on that poster. So obviously people can't see this. This is a poster of famous discoverers of things.
Cambridge 800 years anniversary. And Quentin Bloke produced an illustrated poster. And you're right, she's the only woman. Yes. That's dreadful, actually. And we do have
revelation.
Yeah. I mean, Cambridge has people like Elizabeth Anscombe, for example. There are good women floating about. That's terrible. Thank you for pointing that out.
It wasn't so much a comment on the poster, but because earlier we were talking about whether or not you wanted to author things.
Yeah.
Because everyone says, well, Watson and Crick discovered the double helix structure of DNA, and obviously now a lot of people make the point that Franklin had this huge impact on that. Like, she was really important in the discovery, but she didn't write the paper at the time. They wrote the paper, and her work wasn't considered important. And I guess this is moving away from philosophy again, but I'm thinking about other like female scientists in history, like we'll say Marie Curie. Obviously, everyone knows who she is. Yeah. But there's the argument to be made she wasn't given the
recognition.
The recognition at her time.
Yeah.
So you were saying, it's quite hard to find these female philosophers.
Yeah.
Is it they weren't given the recognition at the time? Is it they weren't given the recognition for the work they did, or is it they weren't allowed to do the work they were supposed to?
That's good. It's okay.
It's the chicken and the egg sort of thing.
Yeah. But part of the problem is that very few women were educated to the same level as men and had that degree of leisure time. So even finding the time to do philosophy was hard. And women who did come out and publish on philosophy, like Margaret Cavendish, were often ridiculed for it. She was called Mad Midge, for example. There's this bit where her carriage goes to London and Samuel Pepys is watching, and he talks about how ridiculous her deportment is.
This is the man who kept a diary of all the women he had sex with and buried his cheese during a fire.
What?
It is.
Are those two parts of his personality related?
Yes,
is it?
Probably. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. These are the kinds of problems that women who published faced. And then many women just didn't publish. So Anne Conway was hailed as a great intellect while she was alive, and Henry Moore dedicated various books to her, and people wrote very highly of her. They went to her estate at Ragley Hall and had conversations with her about philosophy, but her work wasn't published until after her death, presumably in part to avoid this kind of ridicule and to be seen as stepping out of your place.
And you say she had an estate, so I presume some leisure time.
Incredibly wealthy, yes. As was Margaret Cavendish.
Is that a running theme amongst the early women philosophers?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be well educated and you have to have leisure time, and that only happened when you were really privileged. You also had to have an element of luck, being surrounded by men who were happy for you to pursue these kinds of things. So Margaret Cavendish had a very contented husband who supported her in her playwriting and her philosophy. He took her put her in contact with people like Hobbes and Mersenne, and Anne Conway. Her husband was also keenly interested in philosophy, so was her brother, and they put her in touch with Henry Moore, one of the big names of the day. So there's a big dollop of luck involved.
I suppose it's not untrue of the men as well. I mean, the men were often incredibly privileged.
Absolutely.
Lots of leisure time.
Yeah. Not without exception, but often.
No. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being on the podcast, Emily, and
you.
Stuart as well for being a fantastic guest.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Thanks.